Hi class, today we're going to be talking about chapter 6, the Jewish people from the story of the world. In this video, we are covering a lot of things. We're going to be talking about chapter 6 and reviewing that. Barbarians in Mesopotamia, the call of Abraham, the first intermediate period of Egypt, and Abraham's sons. Now, before we get started, I want to give a little disclaimer. I'm assuming all of you grew up reading Bible stories, hearing about them in Sunday school, so I'm not going to be discussing those stories a lot. I'm going to be assuming that you know them and giving you the historical context of those things happening. So let's begin. In the first section of chapter 6, you learned about Abraham, how he goes from the land of Ur to the land of Canaan. He has a son named Isaac, who has a son named Jacob, who has 12 sons, and they become the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. One of those 12 sons, Joseph, is sold into slavery into Egypt. He becomes second in command to Pharaoh, and Joseph's family eventually settles in Egypt during a famine, and this is where the Israelite nation grows. So that's the end of your review. Let's get started on barbarians in Mesopotamia between 2278 and 2154 BC. And again, this is to give you historical context to Abraham. So last time we met, we studied Sargon and how he took over all of the cities in Sumer and he built the Akkadian Empire. His son, Manishtushu, takes over, maintains this empire, and then Naram-Sin the Great, who is his grandson, spreads the Akkadian Empire to its greatest extent. He makes it large. He gets really close to Elamite territory, which we talked about last time. He doesn't conquer them, but he again expands and gets really close to that. In the Akkadian Empire, there's something happening that wasn't happening last time we talked. There's a growing sense of cultural identity. So we had discussed how the Sumerians felt like foreigners in their land. They're being taken over by the Akkadians, who have a different language, who have a different culture. But now there are a lot of people who are living in the Akkadian Empire who don't even remember what life was like before this because they were born into the Akkadian Empire. So with this is a sense of growing cultural identity, all of the Akkadian Empire as one unit in a sense. So this area is becoming more nation-like and less like a military dictatorship, which again, we talked about last time. So during this time when we have this growing sense of cultural identity and the Akkadian Empire is growing, the Gutians invade. The Gutians came from the outside. They were a people group with no language, no history, no inscriptions, no monuments. And unlike the Akkadians who came in and replaced Sumerian culture, the Gutians destroyed culture and then did not replace it. They invaded and took over cities. So from the Mesopotamians, from the Akkadians' perspective, these people coming in were barbaric. They were considered barbarians. Now, here's a quote from the history of the ancient world. No one calls himself a barbarian. That's what your enemy calls you. So I want you to understand that in calling them barbarians, we're looking from the Akkadians' perspective, not the Gutians' perspective, obviously. But I'm going to read a couple inscriptions for you so you can get an idea of how the Akkadians felt about the Gutians. So they said that they are those who are not part of the land. The Gutians are people with no bridle, with the minds of men, but the feelings of dogs, with the features of monkeys. Like small birds, they swooped over the ground in great flocks. Nothing escaped their clutches. No one escaped their grasp. And here's another one. The messenger could no longer travel the highway. The boat of the courier could no longer travel the river. Prisoners manned the watch. Bandits occupied the roads. They planted gardens for themselves inside the cities, not as is usual on the wide field outside. The fields gave no grains, the floods no fish, the orchards no syrup or wine. The clouds did not bring rain, as if this was their fault. Honest men were confused with traitors. Heroes lay dead in heaps on top of heroes. The blood of traitors streamed over the blood of honest men. So again, this was the Akkadians' perspective on the Gutians, but you can see that this was a very, very devastating thing that happened. So by Naram-Sin's death in 2218, the Gutians had taken half of the Akkadian kingdom. The Gutians continue then to take over more and more cities, and they controlled this area for almost half a century. They destroyed, again, we talked about this, but they destroyed the existing culture and they didn't build or replace it with another culture. And this is where we have Abraham, who Susan Wise Bauer calls the first monotheist. So during the Gutian occupation, Terah, who is Abram's father, I'll be using Abram and Abraham interchangeably, sorry. Abram's father takes his family from Ur and he moves them out of this chaos. Terah, we think, was possibly Akkadian and was born during Naram-Sin's rule. So imagine living in this, living in Ur during this time where your cities and everything are being, invaded and taken by these barbarians. I would probably want to move my family away too. So Terah takes his family and he settles in Haran, as you can see on this map. And this is where God calls Abraham to leave his country and his people and go to the land of Canaan. And this God that calls Abraham is not a Sumerian God, not an Akkadian God. He is the one true God. This was possibly a big shift for Abraham because we think that Terah and his family were maybe worshippers of the moon god Sin, which is an Akkadian god. Now when I was a kid and reading the story of Abraham from Genesis, I just kind of assumed that Abraham always followed God and God was like, hey, go to this land, and he does. But maybe it wasn't like this, and maybe their family was, they were following the moon god Sin and these other Akkadian gods. And then the one true God speaks to Abraham and says, leave this place and go. And Abraham went, which is incredible. Anyway, one of the reasons we think that Terah's family were worshippers of the moon god Sin is because of their names. So Terah is a name that is in kinship with Sin. Sarai is the Akkadian version of Sin's wife. Milcah, Terah's granddaughter, is named after the moon god Sin's daughter, Malkatu. And this must have been a big deal for them to have names that honored this god and were devoted to this god. And it must have meant something because God changes Abram and Sarai's names to Abraham and Sarah by adding the syllable ah, which is the first part of his name, Yahweh, which then kind of lays claim on them and says, no, they are not followers of this moon god. They are followers of me. They are my people. Yeah. Anyway, so Abraham travels to the land of Canaan, obeys God, follows God, but I want to give you context. What was happening in Canaan during this time? So in Canaan, we have Western Semitic people living there and building cities up and down the coast. They have established a lot of trade routes, and one of the places that they are trading is with Egypt. And Egypt is where they're getting a lot of their wealth and becoming more affluent in a sense. They've established a tax system, and the Western Semitic people are becoming more organized, they're becoming more urbanized, and this is where Abraham settles. So he goes, but between maybe 2400 to 2000 BC, there is a famine that happens in Canaan, possibly from overplanting, possibly from drought, also probably because the Old Kingdom in Egypt collapses, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But the Semites lose their biggest trading partner. Again, trading with Egypt was bringing in a lot of money, and now this is not happening anymore. So many Semites decide that they're going to travel south to escape this drought, and a lot of them travel to Egypt, which is what Abraham and Sarah did as well. So what was happening in Egypt during this time? Here's a timeline from last time, so you can get a little context. We talked about the First and Second Dynasties, and then the Old Kingdom of Egypt starts. The Third Dynasty is where we have people, pharaohs starting to build pyramids, and then the Fourth Dynasty was considered the golden age of Egypt. We have the Great Pyramid of Giza being built. Egypt is very powerful, very wealthy. So what happened to bring Egypt to a point of collapse? So the end of the Fourth Dynasty happens with Khufu's great-grandson. So Khufu is the one that built the Great Pyramid of Giza. His son Khafre builds the second pyramid. And I'm sorry, my pictures got flipped, but this is the second pyramid down here. He built the second pyramid, and it's 34 feet shorter than the Great Pyramid, and it's built on higher ground to look taller, which is pretty clever. Khafre's son Menkaure builds the third pyramid, and it's only 228 feet tall, and it's half the size of Khufu's. And then Menkaure's son, Shepsetkaf, is buried in a mastaba tomb. So you can kind of see how things are declining. We have to ask ourselves what happened to cause this decline. And Susan Wise Bauer gives a possible explanation as to why the Fourth Dynasty and eventually the Old Kingdom of Egypt ends. She says, since the king was divine, he obviously needed to marry another divinity to maintain the divinity of his heir. The royal family did not admit that any other mortal in Egypt shared in this quality, so the king's siblings were the only possible wives on offer. Following the example of his predecessors, Khafre married his half-sister Khameneptah I. Khameneptah I gave birth to a son and daughter, Menkaure and Khameneptah II. Menkaure, on ascending the throne, then married his full sister, who was also his cousin. Since Khameneptah I, by marrying her half-brother, became her own daughter's half-aunt. She also became both Menkaure's mother and mother-in-law, a challenging role for any woman. Shepsetkaf was thus his father's son, his grandmother's great-nephew, and his mother's first cousin once removed. You don't have to follow all of that, as long as you understand that when intermarriage happens, you get a lot of genetic defects. And it's recorded that there were pharaohs in this time that just died suddenly. One of them had a really weird shaped head. And so there's a lot of health issues happening in the royal family, which is possibly one of the reasons why Egypt started declining. So Fourth Dynasty ends, then we have the Fifth and Sixth Dynasty. This is where Egypt slowly just disintegrates into chaos. And I'm going to read another quote for you. Susan Wise Bauer says, after the wasteful Fourth Dynasty, squandering of Egyptian lives and money, the weakness of the royal family's genes, and the natural self-limiting nature of the pharaoh's divinity, drought provided the final push over the edge. For a little over 100 years, rival dynasties would rule in different cities, and Egypt would be divided between battling kings. So the Old Kingdom ends because of all these things that we just talked about. The first intermediate period begins. It's between the 7th and 10th dynasties, and I'll show you a timeline in just a second. But the first intermediate period is characterized by a lot of insignificant pharaohs who just can't keep the throne for a very long time. Some only ruled for a number of days before another pharaoh took over, and then another pharaoh took over. So here's a timeline. You can see the Old Kingdom of Egypt in green. The 3rd and 4th dynasties were the golden ages. We have pyramids. 5th and 6th were slowly descending. And then 7, 8, 9, 10 were the first intermediate period. So this is where Abraham travels, or this is the time when Abraham travels down to Egypt. So Abraham and other Western Semitic people, they traveled to Egypt during the first intermediate period. The Egyptians don't like these Western Semitic people. They're very hostile towards them. They are annoyed and frustrated with them. And this is possibly why Abraham lies about Sarah when the Pharaoh takes Sarah to be his wife or whatever. And Sarah's probably taken by one of the 10th dynasty's insignificant pharaohs. Again, there were a lot of them. God sends a plague, and the Pharaoh gives Sarah back and Abraham a lot of stuff. This is in Genesis 12 if you want to go read it. So Abraham then returns to Canaan and he settles in Hebron. At this time, God's promise really doesn't seem to be coming true. It's been 20 years since he left because God called him, and Sarah is still childless, and the land is still full of Canaanites. And I want you to think about Abraham's faithfulness, because if I was called by a God I didn't know to go to this land, and you go and your wife doesn't have a kid, there's a drought, so you have to move, and then you move back again, and then the whole place is just full of other people, even though God said he would give you this land, I would probably start getting a little bit frustrated or maybe doubting. And this is where Sarah says, hey, I have this maidservant Hagar. Abraham takes Hagar and has a child with her named Ishmael. Hagar is thought to be an Egyptian maidservant because Hagar in Egyptian literally means immigrant. She is possibly given to Abraham by the 10th dynasty pharaoh. And Hagar ends up running away, tries to go back down to Egypt, but God says, hey, I'm going to take care of you. So Ishmael grows up in Abraham's household, and he is known as the father of the Arab people. You guys all know that eventually Isaac is born and he begins a new race, and he's set apart through circumcision. So Abraham becomes the father not just of the Israelite people, but also the Arab people. However, in his lifetime, Abraham has to fight to keep his family safe. He doesn't see the promise fulfilled, maybe like he thought he might, because when Sarah dies, Abraham has to buy a cave to bury her in because he still has so little land. But we'll see what happens to Israel later on. But before we go, I want to just mention Joseph real quick. You guys read about it in the second section in chapter 6, but we're not going to talk about him because he happens later on. And I want to make sure I give you good historical context to his story. So we're going to talk about him and the Exodus and all of those things in the appropriate historical period. So I promise we will get back to him. Look forward to that, and I will see you next time.